Hey y'all, it's that time again. Can you believe it's already Friday again? Like this week has just flown by, and really the whole month of September is just flying by, because here it is, the 17th. Um, so it's crazy. But anyway, how was your week? It's been raining here, so it's been a lot cooler, and I really like that because I'm not a fan of this humidity that we have here. And you'd think I'd be used to it, but I don't think you can get used to something like the oppressive humidity. But anyway, it's been a good week. Now, my biggest exciting thing that happened this week was Tuesday. I was in Walmart, and I came across the display of cereal from my childhood that was my favorite. My favorite was Boo Berry, but they had Count Chocula, Frankenberry, and Boo Berry. Now, if you're around my age, you remember that back when we were kids, you didn't have to wait until fall or Halloween to get these. You could get them anytime you wanted. You just walk in the grocery store and get them then. But now it's like just a Halloween thing, and to me that's sad, but I guess maybe it makes it more special for me because I don't get to get it just any time, and I guess maybe that's a sign that the times are a-changing. But anyway, that's enough of my mindless rattling on about my less than stellar week. But if you listened last week, you know that we got started on a series about cult leaders. And when we ended things last week, members of the Heaven's Gate cult had just committed the mass suicide in hopes of being picked up by the spaceship that was trailing behind a comet that was passing by Earth. In all, 39 members of the cult had killed themselves over a 3-day period. The one remaining leader, his name was Marshall Applewhite, because as you remember, the other lady that had founded this cult, she died of cancer a few years prior to this. But anyway, he was the third to last member to die. And as you may recall from last week's episode, just days before the mass suicide, the members had recorded their goodbye messages. Well, these were sent out, and soon after the suicides, they were starting to arrive at their destinations. And that's where we're going to pick it up tonight.
Mystery, Murder, and Magic proudly presents
What the Friday? And here's your host, Andrea.
Now, I should begin by telling y'all I do have a live audience while I'm recording this. I didn't get his name, but it's a nice little cricket that's sitting over here on my desk. He's been sitting in the same spot, and I would only know he's alive by he wiggles his little antenna thingies every once in a while. But he's not bothering anybody, so he can stay right there. Alright, so those goodbye messages were sent out, and if you're like me, I was thinking that these goodbye messages were going to these members' loved ones, like their family members, whatever, to tell them goodbye. But no, they weren't. They were going to people that had been affiliated or were still affiliated with Heaven's Gate. One of them went to the BBC department that had produced Louis Theroux's Weird Weekends, which Heaven's Gate had been asked to participate in, but they declined it. Also receiving a package was a man by the name of Rio D'Angelo. Now, Rio had been a member of Heaven's Gate up until 1997, and he decided to walk away from it. But anyway, he received one of the packages on March 25th, and in that package was 2 VHS tapes. One was Applewhite's farewell, and the other tape was the farewell of the others. And there was also a letter in that package, and that letter included a line that said, quote, "We have exited our vehicles just as we entered them," end quote. Well, of course, This set off alarms in Rio's head, and he contacted his boss. His boss drove him over to Los Angeles to where the mansion was located, or he drove from Los Angeles to where the mansion was located in Rancho Santa Fe. And when they got there, he found that the back door had been left unlocked. So he goes in with a video camera so he could record what he found. Well, Rio's boss, he stayed outside while Rio went in. But when he left, the boss encouraged Rio, to call the authorities to report what he had found. Well, the next day he called San Diego County 911. Now, at first, a single deputy went out there to the home to check things out. Well, he entered through a side door, and he saw 10 bodies, and soon he was overcome by the odor of decomposing bodies. I mean, they had only been dead for just a short period, but springtime is very warm in California, so these bodies had already started to decompose and put off those odors. Well, another deputy arrived as backup, I guess you could say, and they went through the whole mansion, and they found all 39 bodies. Well, if you're wondering what ever came of these bodies, they decided to cremate all these people after the investigation. And let's go on with this. As you can imagine now, the media went crazy with this story, and I can remember this, okay? When they began linking it to the passing of that comet, somehow the man that discovered that comet, his name was Alan Hale, he was drawn into the story, and once that happened, his phone didn't stop ringing all day. He waited until the next day to address the situation because he wanted to thoroughly investigate the thing, or research it. Well, of course he wasn't linked to it. Well, over the years, the suicide and the cult itself has been the subject of many TV and film events, and that ranges from deep, thoughtful documentaries to a skit on Saturday Night Live. There's also been songs written about it, as well as books. And an interesting note about those Nike decades that all the members were wearing when they died. When a remaining member was asked about why they had chosen those specific shoes to wear in the mass suicide, the answer was very simple. They got a good deal on them. I mean, you have to love a good sale, right? Now, coming up next, we're talking about the Foursquare Church and its founder, Aimee Semple McPherson. But first, I want us to all take a minute to stretch our legs, fill up our drinks, and I mean, you don't have to, but I feel like we could all use a little breather right here. I mean, we just finished up a big part of the show. Still got some to go. So, if you want to get up, move around. Now, I don't suggest if you're driving to get up and move around until you pull over, but anyway. So, let's take a nice little stretch. All right, y'all. So I hope you're all stretched out. Your cup is full. And you're ready to move forward with our next cult. So our next contestant in the Crazy Cult Leader Championships is a lady by the name of Aimee Semple McPherson. But I do have to say that this isn't like your regular run-of-the-mill cult. So I do want to put that out there. Now, Aimee, she was a Canadian Pentecostal evangelist born in 1890, so this happened a while back. She was also a faith healer, and she would hold these faith healing services that had tens of thousands of people attending. In the 1920s and 1930s, she was a media celebrity, and she was the most publicized Protestant evangelist of her time. Her big claim to fame, though, was the founding of the Foursquare Church. Now, like I said, she was a media celebrity, and the way she did that was by being one of the first evangelists to use the radio to spread the gospel. But let's talk about this Foursquare Church. Aimee would preach weekly at one of the first mega churches. We have mega churches today like Joel Osteen's place in Texas. There's different ones. We have mega churches all over the country that's not as well known maybe as like, I can't think of what Joel Osteen calls his place. But anyway, she had one of the first, and it was called Angelus Temple. Well, eventually her ministry evolved into its own denomination, and this denomination was called the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, or the Foursquare Church for short. Now, Foursquare, when it's like referring to religion, means full gospel, because the four main beliefs were salvation, baptism, divine healing, and the premillennial return of Christ. Well, one thing that was really different, I guess you could say, about Aimee, or at least it was different for those times, was that both her tent meetings and her church services were racially integrated. And that pissed off the KKK. They actually showed up at one of her meetings, but they weren't dressed in their typical Klan attire. But later their hoods were found, the hoods and robes were found on the ground nearby that tent revival. So I guess it was maybe like a silent protest of some sort. And as far as the race relations, she was also known for helping the Hispanic ministries of the LA area. Now, Aimee's services were very dramatic, and this caused the local clergy to criticize her, saying that she was turning the gospel message into mundane entertainment. One of her rival radio evangelists, a man named Robert Schuller, you may have heard of him. I can remember my grandparents talking about him. Anyway, he published this pamphlet called McPhersonism, and in it he called her ministry, quote, out of harmony with God's word, end quote. Well, in early 1925, Aimee let it be known that she was totally opposed to Charles Darwin's teachings on evolution, and she became a big supporter of William Jennings Bryan during the Scopes trial. Well, that trial was about local laws banning the teaching of human evolution. She also was very outspoken in national politics. She voiced her opinion on things like labor unions, communism, and the such, So she was really outspoken, not just as a minister, but just as a female, because back in those times, females weren't very listened to, I guess you could say, back then. And really, she doesn't seem like such a bad person, right? She isn't violent like the others we've been talking about, but this is where things take a turn in Aimee's story. On May the 18th of 1926, she decided to go for a swim at Ocean Park Beach in Santa Monica, California. Well, all of a sudden, she is nowhere to be seen, and soon it was presumed that she had drowned. Well, they did these massive searches, but they were unable to locate her. They couldn't even find a body, so they just assumed, that she had died. Now, there were many sightings, or reports of sightings in the area, and many of them were like miles apart from where she had disappeared. The temple received several calls and some letters saying that they knew of Aimee's whereabouts, and they were demanding ransoms, like they had her, kidnapped or whatnot. So, this led them to believe that, like I said, she was kidnapped, and after several weeks of those leads going nowhere, everyone, including her mom, assumed that she had died. She was deceased. Well, on June 23rd, the temple was preparing for a memorial service for Aimee when her mom received a phone call. The call came from Douglas, Arizona, and the caller said that Aimee was alive in a Douglas hospital. So, of course, they all went down there. But Aimee told officials that while she was on the beach, she was approached by a couple who asked her to pray over their sick child. Well, being the charismatic faith healer that she was, she quickly obliged and walked with them to their car. But when they got to her car, she said they shoved her inside and they put a cloth over her face that had been laced with like some kind of drug, and it caused her to lose consciousness. Well, she woke up in this lean-to in a Mexican desert, and while her kidnappers were away, she escaped through a window. She walked through the desert for like 11 to 13 hours, and she collapsed near a house at the Mexican border. And it was from there that she was taken to that hospital in Douglas. Well, a lot of people, including Los Angeles prosecutors, weren't buying her story, and they all had ideas of why she had disappeared. Now, most of them thought it was a publicity stunt. And then finally they came up with the theory that she had ran away with a former employee named Kenneth Ormiston and had been staying with him at a cottage in California in this resort town that he had rented for him. Well, at the end of May, the two traveled for around like 3 weeks, and all of that time they somehow remained hidden from public view. Well, sometime around June 22nd, Kenneth drove her to Mexico, dropped her off 3 miles from where she was found, and then she walked the rest of the way to where she was, found. So through the entire inquiry into this theory, Aimee maintained the story that she was in fact kidnapped, and there was even defense witnesses to back up her story. Now, a lot of the evidence that had been used against her had been given to the police by the local media. It was also brought out that the majority of the investigation had been paid for by a Los Angeles area newspaper, and that cost them like a whopping $500,000, and that was a lot of money back then. A trial was set for January 1927. Aimee, her mom, and a few others were charged with conspiracy, perjury, and obstruction of justice. If she had been found guilty, Aimee would have been facing a maximum sentence of 42 years in prison. But fortunately for her, the prosecution started having trouble with their case. Like, witnesses were changing their testimonies, and some of the evidence was very questionable as far as where it had originated from. Some of the evidence had been made a mess of, and other evidence was just completely lost. Well, on January the 2nd, Kenneth Ormiston up and says that it was another woman that he had actually been staying with in that cottage. Well, by January the 10th, all the charges against Aimee and the others were dropped. And even though those charges were dropped, the bad news reporting still kind of followed her around, I guess for months. They were just talking about it, and it was just a big fiasco. Because that wasn't enough, during that time period, several allegations of extramarital affairs started coming out. But those that it had been suspected that she was having the affairs with denied that the affairs ever happened. The years that followed were quite controversial for Aimee as well, and it seems that drama followed her for quite some time. Well, on September 26, 1944, Aimee passed away from an apparent accidental drug overdose. Now, although her death certificate lists her cause of death as unknown, around 10 o'clock that morning, her son had came into her hotel room in Oakland, California. Now, she was there for several revival services. So when her son entered the room, he found her unconscious, and there were pills and capsules like scattered all around her. It was known that she took some powerful sleep aids, but some people said that it was suicide, and others, claimed that it was accidental. But we weren't there, so we can't really say. Now, she passed away around 11:15 that morning. So he found her around 10, and by 11:15 she had been pronounced dead. Well, 45,000 people waited in line until 2 a.m. to pay their respects to her as she lay in state at the temple. They stayed in line. Some of them stayed in line until like 2 a.m. I don't know if, sorry, I had to get a drink. These people were that devoted to her, or they were curiosity seekers, or a little of both. But anyway, just because she passed away doesn't mean that church died, though, y'all. Look, there's more than 67,000 Foursquare churches worldwide. 67,000. There's several that are right here in South Carolina. Now, the first Foursquare Church that I had heard of, or rather saw, was in Myrtle Beach. I was a teenager at that time, but I remember thinking that was an odd name for a church. But I didn't really put a lot of thought into it. I mean, you know. Now, looking on the church has the Foursquare Church, not just the individual church. I guess it's like a corporate website, but they have a church locator. And the other ones that are located here in South Carolina don't have the word Foursquare included in them, so I thought it was interesting. I can't talk. And I just wonder if there's like a reason why they didn't include it. I don't know why they would or wouldn't, but anyway. Now, as far as when Aimee went missing, I wasn't there. I don't know her personally, but I really believe it was a publicity stunt. Maybe she was slipping in popularity to some other evangelist, and she just needed to get her name back out there in the public, you know? I really don't know. That's just like my random thought. But we're going to move on now to our final cult leader for tonight, and she comes to us from Argentina. She started preaching in 1981. Her name is Valentina de Andrade, and she's perhaps one of the cruelest cult leaders that we've talked about yet. Now, like I said, she started preaching in 1981, and it was that same year that she said she started receiving these messages. At first, she was just doing some fortune telling and like some clairvoyance type stuff, and her neighbors were really impressed. And I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with either of those. I mean, some people do truly have a gift, I believe. But soon after, she wowed her neighbors with, you know, that kind of things, like what some people call parlor tricks. The messages that she was receiving took a dark twist. Soon Valentina was preaching to anyone who would listen, and the subject of her sermons was that the world was going to end soon. Well, to help spread her message, she opened her own church, and she called it the Superior Universal Alignment. Her message was very simple. God didn't exist, Jesus was an extraterrestrial, and she was there to enlighten the masses. The principal belief in her teachings was that all children born after 1981 were the reincarnation of evil. So, say you're one of Valentina's followers. You give birth on January 1st, 1982. Well, you are expected to abandon your child and the child that you've just given birth to, so that you could gain salvation and leave Earth on a spaceship before the end of days. Now, it sounds a lot like the Heaven's Gates, the Heaven's Gate cult, with the exception of talking about the kids. But anyway, well, the first day that Valentina had predicted the apocalypse to come, nothing happened. Well, as you can imagine, Valentina's followers started losing faith in her. And I mean, rightly so, because she had said it was going to happen that day and it didn't. Well, Valentina was quick to make an excuse. She said that it was because her followers hadn't proven their loyalty. I mean, like, so she was basically saying it was their fault. And she also said that their belief in the whole thing was weak. So all this was their fault. She went on to tell them that if they would prove their devotion to her and leave her with no doubts that they were devoted, that spaceship would finally come, and that's when things started getting even darker. children began disappearing. Altogether, 19 children went missing between 1989 and 1993. 5 dead bodies of children were found. Every single one of those kids were male, and they were between the ages of 8 and 13. They had been raped, tortured, and then stabbed to death. Plus, they had been mutilated with their genitals and some of their vital organs removed. Well, naturally, the public started panicking as the local authorities struggled to find who had did this to these kids. Well, fortunately, one of those kids who was intended to be a victim of theirs escaped. He was 9 years old, and I can't pronounce his name. I will give his initials. It was WP. But when he escaped, he went straight to the police, and he was able to name every single one of his captors, including Valentina. Police were able to arrest 4 of the men right away, but Valentina escaped the country. By 2003, 5 of her followers had been put on trial and given life sentences in prison for their part in these heinous murders. Hang on, I got to get another sip of my water. And just so you know, my cricket's still sitting here. But anyway, so 5 of those had been put on trial and given life sentences in prison for their part in the heinous murders. Now, it wouldn't be until 11 years later that Valentina herself would be captured and brought back to Brazil to stand trial. During the trial, that was pretty much the trial of the century there in Brazil, her teachings were brought out for everyone to hear. Now, people were just absolutely shocked that this had been going on, and they knew nothing of it until now. And the public adamantly pushed for Valentina to be found guilty. But that didn't happen. Because in Brazil, all that is needed is a majority vote, and in this case, it was 6-1 in Valentina's favor. She was acquitted of all charges. Now, her defense had been able to put doubt in the jury's minds about whether she had even been in the country when these murders took place. But the thing is, remember the little boy that escaped named her as one of his captors. Now, to this day, her website is active. Now, for whatever reason, I can't get it to load. It's like it's there, but it just doesn't load. For me on my computer or phone now, I mean, it might load for you. Now, I have read that she continued to preach, but whether she is now is uncertain. And I'm not even actually able to find information on whether she's even still alive as of 2021. If you know if she's still alive or not, that would be great if you could let me know, because, I'm very curious about these things. And anyway, now I could go on, but as you see, these stories are so similar that it would be redundant to keep going. And there's so much out there to talk about. So next week we're going to be moving on to another subject. Don't know what that is yet, but we're going to move on to it. But if there's one that you really think, like a cult that you really think we need to talk about, don't be shy. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. Or you can even send us an email at 3mpodcast3@gmail.com. Now, I'm not opposed to anything that y'all suggest. So, I've told you before, your comments, suggestions, whatever, are very welcomed. Now, that's all I've got for this week. Don't forget that in the morning we'll be back with our all new Weekend Weird Files. And until then, have very sweet dreams tonight.